Hello, and welcome to Road to WILDS, a Monster Hunter retrospective. This video is the third installment of my retrospective series, so if you'd like to start from the first episode, you can click here. Now, let's get on with the show. MHF2. No, not MHF1. No, not MHF. Not MHFU. Rude. Not MHG, R, W, X, or DX. I'm talking about Monster Hunter Freedom 2. Freedom 2 is the West's first exposure to the second major wave of innovations to the Monster Hunter franchise. That is to say, it's the first Generation 2 game released outside of Japan, as we unfortunately did not receive Monster Hunter 2 DOS. Freedom 2 makes some incredible steps forward for the franchise from its prior PSP outing and Monster Hunter Freedom 1. So, in this episode of the retrospective, I'd like to address the following questions. What are some of the major updates added to Freedom 2 over Freedom 1? What are some of the aspects of Freedom 2 that hold it back? And finally, would Freedom 2 make a good starting point for new fans to the Monster Hunter series? Just like last time, I'll be answering these questions based on my experience from my recent playthrough of the Village Quest of Monster Hunter Freedom 2. And like before, my conclusions will be drawn from my own subjective opinions. Now, for a little bit of my history with Monster Hunter Freedom 2. Freedom 2 and Freedom Unite kind of blend together for me, which I suppose is appropriate considering Freedom Unite, the PSP title that follows Freedom 2, is essentially the Ultimate or G version of the game. That aside, I do recall being thrilled to finally get to use the longsword after seeing it in many different Monster Hunter 2 DOS trailers. One fun fact, up until Freedom 2's release, I referred to the longsword weapon class as the Tachi. This was because I couldn't find a localized name for the weapon post Monster Hunter 2 DOS release. I even called it this for a while after Freedom 2 came out. I think by about Freedom Unite, I finally got to calling the weapon class by its appropriate localized name. By the time Freedom 2 came out, I believe it was just my brother and I that hunted together. While I know it was possible to connect online via X-Link Kai, I only ever did local multiplayer. From what I recall, I didn't have a Wi-Fi connection in my house for a while, so I'll chalk that up to the main reason as to why I wasn't able to play online back then. That said, from what I can tell, there's still a scene of hunters that play Monster Hunter Freedom 2 and Freedom Unite to this day, which I gotta say is really cool. I love Monster Hunter 1 and Freedom 1, but it was such a relief to finally get to play some of the content added in Monster Hunter DOS. Speaking of additions to Monster Hunter Freedom 2, let's talk about some of them now. Some of the new additions that I, and likely many other Western fans at the time, anticipated were the new weapon types. The longsword, gun lance, hunting horn, and bow all debut for the Western releases in Monster Hunter Freedom 2. Somewhat like dual blades were a bit of an offshoot from Sword and Shield, longsword is somewhat of a derivative of greatsword, gun lance is a somewhat derivative to lance, and hunting horn is somewhat derivative of the hammer. These weapons even share weapon trees. The only odd one out here is bow, which I guess you could say is derived from bowgun, and that they're both ranged weapons. Anyway, these are fantastic additions to the roster of weapons. In my playthrough, I primarily used longsword, along with lance and greatsword, but I did dabble with just about every weapon in the training school. I'd say the only weapon I had a bit of trouble finding my footing with was hunting horn, but that in no way means it's a bad weapon, far from it. All the new weapons feel very powerful, and each fill a niche nicely. I'd say this is easily one of the biggest jumps in quality content from Freedom 1 to Freedom 2. Oh, and before I go on to the next part, some of the older weapons got new attacks. For example, Greatsword finally got its signature charge slash. It's not nearly as accessible as it is in future games, but it's still a powerful addition for an already powerhouse of a weapon. Well, I called my shot. I don't know if that redeems the feint, but it's pretty incredible the amount of new monsters that we get in Monster Hunter Freedom 2. All of the previous large monsters and their variants return, along with about a dozen more new monsters. Some noteworthy additions are Tigrix, the flagship box art monster. Then you have Kangalala, Blungonga, and Rajang, who are part of the new primate monster class. We also have the crab-like Carapacian monsters such as Danyo Hermitar and Shogun Cienatar. And last but not least, the Elder Dragons, which include Kushala Daura, Chameleos, Lunastra, and Teostra. There are a few I left out, but this just gives you an idea of the amount of things there is to hunt in the game. And with new things to hunt comes new armor and weapons. It's safe to say, there's a lot of stuff to hunt in Monster Hunter Freedom 2. There are a ton of new maps added to Freedom 2. Based on my playthrough, the only returning map appears to be the Forest and Hills from Monster Hunter 1 and Freedom 1. And all the new maps are great. The starting zone is the Snowy Mountain, and is the backdrop to the new village, Poki. To me, this is a fascinating decision since I want to say most Monster Hunter games start players in a mild or temperate zone, like the Forest and Hills, the Deserted Island, or the Ancestral Steppe. The jungle is a nice tropical woodsy zone with a series of caves and beautiful beaches. The swamp is a brilliantly gloomy area with a winding cave system. I love the atmosphere in the wheat field and the wooded zones of the swamp. The volcano is, well, the volcano, and easily one of my favorite zones, maybe in the entire franchise, is the Ancient Tower. You don't get to access the Ancient Tower until the later tiers of the village quest, but it's stunningly beautiful. It feels very Shadow of the Colossus, or Eco. Very faded glory, mysterious and foreboding. I would say overall, the zone designs are improved across the board. There are still some places that your camera can get hung up on or obscured by foreground objects, but it's not nearly as bad as some of the worst offenders from Freedom 1. Speaking of offenders from Freedom 1, they finally fixed Area 9 in the Forest and Hills. Sort of. The camera isn't nearly as tight and claustrophobic as it was in Monster Hunter 1 and Freedom 1. The narrow corridor is still not a good place to fight, but I will welcome any improvement to Area 9 from Freedom 1. There are also day and night versions of most zones. Along with the change in lighting and monsters that appear, certain parts of the zones may become accessible or inaccessible depending on the time. For example, the island to the far north of the jungle zone is only accessible during the day. And at night, there are poison pits that appear in certain areas of the swamp zone.
Why am I toxic? Okay.
These little touches are the cherry on top of what is already a stellar assortment of maps. Like Kokoto before it, Poke Village has its fair share of welcome distractions in between hunts. The feline kitchen, training school, and farm all make returns in Monster Hunter Freedom 2. All of them function roughly the same, but each has been given an appropriate facelift. The Poke Farm starts out as a lazy little pasture in the mountains that expands to a bustling workplace. The feline kitchen also has a new look, and the chefs sporting Poke-appropriate chef clothing as they level up. Finally, the training school has been expanded. There are various types of training school hunts you can undertake, which range from basic weapon training to more traditional fight this monster with this loadout kind of hunts. These training school hunts make for great distractions, and they're also a great way to gather Poke Points to upgrade the farm. All in all, great improvements across the board. While I played the PSP titles back when they were released, I forgot one neat little feature that the game implemented starting with Freedom 2. And that feature is the ability to import your character from Freedom 1. Game data has been found in your memory stick. Do you import? Oh, okay. Okay. I forgot all about this. You get to keep all Rare 3 and below items. So you can start with a potentially loaded character, which is really nice. And while you can't carry over your weapons, you are given special tickets for each weapon you had. The tickets vary based on the rarity of the weapons carried over. The tickets allow you to craft higher end early game weapons with fewer material costs, which was also a pleasant surprise. Feel free to correct me in the comments, but I think this is one of the only times you're able to import a character from one generation to the next. You can't talk about a new Monster Hunter title without mentioning its new music. I'm happy to report that all the music continues to please the ear. Honestly, I can't think of a mainline Monster Hunter title that didn't have good music. Also, the Poke Village theme is a classic. I feel like people who haven't even played Freedom 2 or Freedom Unite would still get some strange feeling of nostalgia when hearing the Poke Village theme. It's just that good. Menus and basic UI elements still look about what you'd expect from a PSP Monster Hunter title. However, the Quest Complete screen got a nice update. Oh, look at this production, dude. So much more presentation than the first game. The animations for all the new weapons are weighty and interesting to look at. They really sell the identity of new weapons. Finally, we have some new monster ecology videos, which are fantastic. One of my favorites is Kushala Daurus. He's like platinum when he emerges from his husk. It's really cool. I think it's safe to say Freedom 2 is a huge improvement across the board in almost every regard. And thankfully, this trend continues for just about every single title after Freedom 2, at least as far as the Western releases go. However, it's worth noting some of the minor issues the game has, just to be fair. Issues such as... Yep, here we are again. While the camera is significantly improved over the first generation games, it still has some issues. You'll find that at times your camera is completely obscured when in close quarters with some large monsters. I'm looking at you, Gravios. The camera still goes crazy when your hunter is knocked against a wall like it did in previous games, and it still gets hung up on level geometry. Yep. I know I keep coming back to the camera oddities in each episode, but I feel like it shouldn't be glossed over. The good news is, while the camera is not perfect, it is improved. I believe the games continue to get even better in this regard as the series continues. My control gripes are even more minor by comparison. I found a few times my inputs would not register, specifically when performing draw attacks. So I'm still getting the odd, like dropped input, and I'm not sure what's causing it. There. I must have pressed it 3 times. While I'm not 100% sure, I believe this was because I was feathering the sprint button and then changing from the run animation to the sprint animation caused my inputs to not be registered. It might be because I'm sprinting. It might get the inputs kind of frazzled when I'm doing that. Again, a very minor complaint. One might even say a nitpick. Okay, you know the game is pretty good when I have to dip this low for drawbacks. And I know a lot of these get fixed either in the next game or further down the line, so they're minor conveniences at best. So what kind of inconveniences? Some of the same stuff that was kind of annoying in Monster Hunter 1 and Freedom 1. Things like not being able to combine your items within your item box, inventory limit issues, and the kind of sloppy implementation of decorations. Since I didn't talk about decorations earlier, let's talk about them now. Decorations are overall a great addition. They allow you to slightly tweak your skill numbers to unlock a skill if you're just short a few points, or negate a penalty if you're just over a few. That being said, they're kind of tedious to manage, especially if you use multiple weapons and armor sets. You have to go to the armory NPC every time you need to attach or remove a decoration. And because you can't save weapon and armor loadouts, you need to switch your decorations every time you change equipment. Not a huge deal in the slightest, but I figured I'd mention some of the minor quality of life nitpicks. I put this at the bottom because it's really only a complaint that comes with having played more recent games. However, I'll use the Longsword's moveset as an example to illustrate my point. Your only attacks are pretty much your triangle/circle combo, your spirit slash combo, and your evasive slash. That only shifts you backwards, not side to side. Longsword, as a result, has very little to nothing in the way of defensive abilities. So I'm testing to see if... I don't think Longsword has the kind of weapon counter. That said, Longsword pretty much makes up for it in that it's an offensive powerhouse. So, that's it? No other drawbacks to highlight? Well, we still need to talk about how awesome the game is at teaching you about effective strategies and perseverance. Yep, I'm not ranting about Egg Quest again or some heinous fight I had with a particular monster. Quite the opposite. I want to highlight an experience I had fighting the Monster Hunter 2 DOS box art monster, Kushala Dauro. Kushala is one of, if not the first Elder Dragon that most players will face when they play through the village quest. I thought, okay, there's Kushala Dauro right there. No fanfare, like, hey, there he is, Kushala Dauro. Wow, okay, so 4-star is going to be very interesting. As a result, the game takes this chance to grab the hunter by the shoulders, shake them, and yell, "Wake the hell up."
I'll take care of this. Calm down. Calm down. Get a hold of yourself.
Doctor, you're wanted on the phone.
Kushala and Elder Dragons in general change up the game in that their patterns, attacks, and counter windows are a bit different from the wyverns and beasts you faced up to this point. As a result, hunters may find that they get absolutely stomped on their first couple attempts on Elder Dragons, which was definitely the case for me in my playthrough. Alright. Well, that's unfortunate. I felt pretty defeated until I started noticing unconventional openings and opportunities to attack. And I found my rhythm with this hunt, I think. I think I know what I'm supposed to do to keep the pressure on and to get success here, so that's extremely satisfying. Once I started catching on, I realized with a minor adjustment to my strategy and approach, the hunt was not nearly as impossible to conquer as previously perceived. This whole experience took me back to why I love this series of games, and the games like it. I hadn't really been seriously challenged to change up my tactics on my playthroughs up to this point, so adjusting and succeeding felt amazing. That felt really good. That's a feeling like if you've ever played the Dark Souls franchise, Elden Ring, Bloodborne, and you've been getting your butt kicked by a boss, but then you figure out its weaknesses. While Kushala would prove to be the easiest Elder Dragon for me to beat in the long run, it was a great wake-up call for me to take a step back and reevaluate my strategy in the face of adversity. I'm curious if anyone else watching has had a similar experience. If so, with which monster? I'd love to hear all your hunting stories. Alright. Yeah, that was actually extremely rewarding doing this. Well, that's it for the major drawbacks I could come up with Monster Hunter Freedom 2. Mind you, I didn't do any egg quests since I didn't need to, so they could be just as bad or worse. But yeah, it's great when I have to scrape the barrel for things to nitpick. And since there isn't much to complain about, let's talk about how great Freedom 2 is as a starting point for new fans wishing to go back and play some of the older games in the series. We're going to be retreading some of the same ground as before with the highlight section, but with a slightly different perspective. New fans wishing to play some of the older games may be disenchanted with the idea of not having their favorite weapon type accessible in games like Monster Hunter 1 and Freedom 1. Well, with the huge addition to the weapon roster in Freedom 2, odds are a lot of players will be pleased to see their weapons debut. I'm looking at you, longsword users. And while the weapons are much different beasts from their modern versions, they still carry some of the core fundamental strategies necessary to use them effectively. As a bit of a side note, it's amazing how much easier it is to use certain weapons in more modern games like World and Rise after spending some time in their respective weapons in these early games. It's like taking off weighted clothing in Dragon Ball. Freedom 2, like Freedom 1 before it, has the ability to allow you to import your character into the following game, Monster Hunter Freedom Unite. While the ability to import from Freedom 1 to Freedom 2 was somewhat limited, in that you only transferred rarity 3 items and below and your weapons were re-rolled into tickets, the Freedom 2 to Freedom Unite transfer process transfers everything. While modern games like World and Rise obviously transfer their data to their expansions, the whole save file rollover thing was pretty neat and a welcome addition to the franchise. Well, another step closer to Wilds. Monster Hunter Freedom 2 is a wonderful experience. I had a blast on my playthrough, and I hope my joy, enthusiasm, and love for the game came through in this video. Freedom 2 finally got us out of the first hunting generation, and I think it did it phenomenally. And yeah, sure, Freedom 2 isn't perfect, but with each title, Capcom is ironing out imperfections and crafting an even better game than the last. Will the next game, Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, prove to be the peak of the series? Find out on the next episode of Road to Wilds, a Monster Hunter retrospective. And thank you for watching.